Hello, one and all. Here I am on Sunday. I guess it's still morning. I'm about to go to church in like an hour. So I thought I'd take this time to film a video. Film a video about Genesis 13. You know, the one after Genesis 12, the one after the one I made two videos about. That one. But before I do, I feel like it's important that I acknowledge a few things about said videos. First, I said that this was the self-individuation of the Christ principle, starting from Genesis 12 and going on through Exodus. This is true. It's also true that it is the individuation of Christ himself in history. That is, this narrative is symbolically depicting Christ's development and maturity as a child, not on the outer level, but on the inner level. But it amounts to the same thing, because really what it's depicting is it's depicting the growth of God as a human, whether that's Christ who did it perfectly or us who do it imperfectly. And so to the extent that we model Christ, the Lord, in his earthly incarnation, as it were, we will develop and exemplify this story. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, you're going to find that a lot of the interpretation for Genesis 13 continues and repeats the same themes as in Genesis 12. That's on purpose, even though it seems very different. You know, Genesis 12, they're going to Egypt, they're doing a deception. In Genesis 13, they're leaving Egypt, and Abram, not Abraham yet, doesn't have the ha at this point. What's happening is that Abram is separating from his, I think it's his nephew Lot. You know, and so they're separating because they can't get along. This is depicting similar themes, not just similar themes, but about similar narratives and similar affective structures. And the reason why, even though it seems different, is because, well, think about your dreams. Think about how oftentimes you'll say, oh, I was doing this, I was going here, there was something across the street, there was a flood, whatever. Oh, and then flash forward, I was here, and then something was here. There's always that moment of, like, when you're recounting a dream at least, a sense of flash forward, a sense of a jump, a discrete difference. It doesn't feel like that necessarily in the dream, but when you retell it, yes, there is a sense that this is something that happened. What happened here, I don't really remember, but then this happened. And so, but what you're going to find if you listen to people's dreams or you read your own dreams is that the dreams that are separated by the flash forward bit, you know, they're always depicting the same thing, or at least very similar things. Let me give an example. So I was a few weeks ago, I think, I was dreaming about how I was in like the Imperial City from The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. But it was also Skyrim, because I could go into this, like, ruin in it that was never seen, even though people normally see it. I mean, the outside, they never notice it. So I go inside, and there's this Dwemer, you know, like an Elder Scrolls dwarf, you know, the race that was supposed to have disappeared forever, inexplicably. And there was one there, and he told me he was suffering from the gases that were coming up from beneath, and he was incapacitated. And he told me that my mission was to go to the deepest Dwemer ruin, the deepest dwarven ruin, find a secret Book of Mormon and bring it back to the surface. He said that if I could do this, my health and my stamina would increase by 90 points permanently. And you know that if you play Skyrim, a 90-point increase to 2 stats is a huge thing. So that's the first dream. Second dream was, it was our garage, right? But there was like this Yoda thing. It wasn't Yoda, but it was like an artifact of Yoda's that resembled Yoda. You know, from Star Wars, Yoda, you know, and that guy. And he couldn't leave, this artifact couldn't leave the garage, since if we got it to the open door, it would close. The only time it could leave was the 4th of July, but we couldn't wait that long. We needed to figure out a way to get it out, and it was still an open problem. And then the third dream is that there was someone, I was in the Scooby-Doo gang, and they were commissioning me to retrieve an artifact from the ancient Lamanites, which are a group of people from the Book of Mormon. And they said that if I could find this artifact, they would give me $2,000 worth of eggs made by birds that would hatch snakes. And so you notice that these three narratives are the same narrative. there is something valuable, something incredibly valuable, something salvifically, messianically valuable, hidden away in a dark place, an ancient place, like a cave, a tomb, a dungeon. And going there, finding it, and bringing it back will be so, so valuable. And in each case, they're telling me that it is I who will do it. Now, I'm not claiming that I'm a messiah, even though I like to think so in my less humble moments. But it's more that, because what I'm doing here, right, is I'm doing the same thing. I'm going deep into these Swedenborgian books, and I'm finding things that are written in abstruse language and extracting the living kernel, like the valuable thing that will give value to other people and to me. It'll give you insight. It'll give you inspiration. It'll give you vigor, stamina, health, to use Skyrim terms. But the point, right, is that there is a similar structure in each narrative, even though they are very different images. Because if you look at them in the right way, using what Swedenborg would say a consciousness independent of space and time, a consciousness of mental state of affection, is what he called it, you can see that they are actually the same narrative. And the same is true in this case. So, and another way to say that, right, is that this is something Mark Twain said. He says that history doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes. And this is true here. Genesis 12 isn't repeated in Genesis 13, but they rhyme. And so let me, without further ado, continue this exegesis of Swedenborg's, which isn't his exegesis, of course. He is unfolding the text. He's unfolding the latent emotional spheres, these lights in the text, is what he calls them later on. These so many lights in the text. This is the inner meaning. And so, Genesis 13. This bird is upset. Let me go and take him out. Actually, yeah, I'm going to do that. Hey, birdie. Come. 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 Here you go. Little birdie. Yeah. So, and that's a symbol right there, by the way. Lots of people have been dreaming about birds recently. That's a synchronicity. And a lot of people have been dreaming about houses for birds, about cages for birds. What is an appropriate cage or a house for a bird? My friend, one of my friends, the same one I referenced in my CES letter video, Micah, he had a kind of a spiritual intuition, kind of like a hypnagogic voice, an intuition, tell him when he was having a crisis about the state of the world, what he could do. A voice told him that building a birdhouse is an act of love. And that's true. Because a birdhouse, like the dove of the Holy Spirit, that and the dove in Noah's Ark story, the bird is the spirit, is the thing that you can't control, but we want to control. The thing that can alight on our shoulder, like a Disney princess. But it needs a home. Not a home that imprisons it, like there, but a home that can house it. And to me, what I'm doing here, and what Swedenborg was doing, is he's taking this bird, this inner meaning, this internal sense of the word, and he's giving it a birdhouse. This is also significant, seeing in regard to the Fantastic Beasts series of movies, which the latest one of which came out a few weeks ago. I actually don't think it's that bad, the most recent one. In fact, I think it's amazing and crucial. And here's why. Newt Scamander is a Noah figure. He is someone who is there to save the world by saving the things that are innocent, by saving the things that are the lifeblood of the world, the animals, the beasts, the fantastic beasts, by giving them a place to be, by building a house for a bird, by building a birdhouse. And, of course, there is an evil that threatens that world, and it's Grindelwald. And Grindelwald is amazing in that movie because he's so compelling. He makes a compelling case. He depicts World War II happening. He says we could prevent this if we controlled the Muggles. But they don't see that by surrendering autonomy, no, by exerting control, by trying to use ideology, the intellect unmarried to love, to control the world, they would make things a lot worse. For the greater good, in other words, is Grindelwald's motto, i.e. the intellect alone. Not letting things be themselves, not respecting the animals, not respecting the simple things, but controlling things for the greater good. Control! It's like the idea that we can control language. We can control what people do and what people say because it upsets us. No, we can't control it. In fact, if we could control it, we would only be inciting rebellion. Control of other people's actions does not work. This is a Swedenborgian idea. Control only invites resentment. God invites by inviting us to love, not by controlling us. No, never controlling us. And so this is the difficulty with the social justice mentality. Valid though their goals are, though their ends are, the idea is that if you can compel someone to do something, they will be doing it grudgingly, as something in the Book of Mormon says. The only real way to change the world is to change hearts, and you never change hearts by force, unlike Grindelwald would say. But now the bird is out, now the inner meaning is loose, we can continue. So, Genesis 13 depicts a separation of sorts. What happens in the story, this chapter, is that Abram and Sarai and Lot are leaving Egypt. They're leaving Egypt and they're going into Canaan, the promised land. And they have lots of cattle. They have lots of cattle and wealth, actually. This is the stuff that had been trickled up from Egypt, is this wealth, this cattle. And then what happens is that he makes an altar to the Lord there. And what happens is that the land could not sustain both of them. There wasn't enough space for both of them. And there was actually contention between Abram's men and Lot's men, and they're fighting each other. And then he says, and Abram basically says, let's not fight. So yes, the idea is that there is a separation, a disjunction between between these two. Because what happens after their fight is that they say, oh, if you go right, I'll go left. If you go left, I'll go right. And then Lot goes to this one place, which is called Jordan. That's on the left here. Goes to Jordan. And then Abram goes to Canaan, and they both flourish. And then when Abram is in Canaan, God says, every bit of land you see, I will give to you. I will make your seed like the dust of the earth, and no one can count it, like the sand of the sea. And you can sense that that's powerful, right? But you don't know why. Not yet, but I'm going to let the bird out. So, we begin by a trickling up from Egypt, right? Abram, which is that part of you, the part of all of us, which Swedenborg would call the divine good principle. And that's what does good things. That's what does righteous things, what does charitable things. The thing in you that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to Christ, that you speak when you suddenly speak words that you don't know why you're speaking, but you just do them, and you realize that they were good after the fact. You had been put to sleep, so in other words, and the words come out. In fact, that's the only way something good can be done. The celestial angels are always in that ignorance. They're always in that sleep, even though they're awake at the same time. They are the most intelligent, the most aware, because they have that sleep, that trust in the ground of being at the root of their consciousness. The other thing, right? So Abram is that, and Lot is what Swedenborg would call the natural mind. What would he call it? It's the outer self. Yes, the outer self. So you have this inner self, which is Abram, and then you have the outer self. And the inner self is the divine, basically. It's the Lord. Swedenborg actually says that at one point. It's not your intermediate self, not your rationality, not what does things based on decision, but what just happens through you. That's the Lord. That's the innermost self. That's the root of heaven, the core of of being is that. And Lot is the outer self, not the thing that decides rationally either, but like the thing that does things because, oh, they're good, I'm going to walk over here. Oh, it's bad, I'm going to walk away from this. It's not really thinking, not really reflecting. It's just doing things externally, like an animal in a certain sense. Not to diss animals, of course, but without the conscious human reflection. It's like you just the thing that it is actually the root of evil when it's usurped the inner self, which is a problem. When we do things that we know we shouldn't do, that aren't good because we have a lust or a desire or a doubt or a rage, that's the outer self. The outer self specifically does that because it trusts what things look like and not what they are, and that's crucial. So, for instance, the church building that my family goes to, but that I don't go to because I go to a singles ward, which is kind of like a church building for young single Latter-day Saints. You should look it up. I can see the church building right there, but what's interesting is that this bar on the window, oh, it's snowing too. This bar on the window is almost blocking my view of the church. But because it's blocking my view, I see the bar on the window, and then I see the church, but they're kind of in the same space in my field of vision. And if I didn't have the intelligence of moving around and such, and the intelligence of a certain level of abstraction, I wouldn't be able to see that one is farther away from the other, that the bar isn't next to the church and is like so much bigger than it. We wouldn't learn perspective. And the external self is the one, in an exaggerated sense, that doesn't know those two are different. That trusts the things that appear as valuable as the same value as really valuable things because they just seem so in the moment. It doesn't have the intelligence of having a removed perspective. And that's Lot. Lot is the thing that is like, oh, look, something over there. It's the thing that doesn't really trust truth, that only trusts appearances. But what happens in this story is that they get into Canaan, and Abram builds an altar. And what that means is that with all this stuff he's gotten from Egypt, this good that he has extracted from what he's learned, and of course Lot is a parallel to the Egypt in this sense. Lot isn't Egyptian at all, but he serves the same function. And you can see this in dreams sometimes, and I referenced this obliquely with the 3 dreams. For instance, Yoda has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon, but he plays the same role because they're both old, wise things. In the same sense, Lot serves the same purpose as the Book of Mormon because they're both superficial, lustful things. I mean, not the Book of Mormon, excuse me. Lot served the same purpose as Egypt, excuse me. The Book of Mormon isn't very lustful. In fact, it's probably not lustful enough. Well, what happens, right, is that Abram is using this wealth he's gotten from Egypt to worship the Lord, and you need that. You need goodness and truth you've extracted from the things you've learned, like I'm reading scripture, right? I'm learning this from a TED Talk, I'm learning this on YouTube. You learn these from what he calls memory knowledges, right? You learn these things and you extract goodness from them, and you do it by doing good things, right? It's like you aren't worshiping God if you just read scripture and you don't act based on what you learn there. No. You have to act from the goodness you feel from it and the truth you learn from it to really worship God. And that's what he's doing here. He actually talks about how the root, in this chapter, the root of worship is activity. You have to be active to worship. And what ends up happening is that after this worship, he starts to notice that there's a disjunction between his inner self, the active thing that's worshiping, and the outer self, the thing that resists it. It's almost like you want to do something good, but no, I can't. It's like, no, you think you can't. Or it's like, oh, it's too hard. It's too hard. It isn't really too hard. If you tried to do it, you would find that it would be easy, but as long as it looks too hard. This is the appearance, right? It looks too hard. I'm not going to do this because it looks too hard. I'm not going to go to church. I'm not going to go to the temple. I'm not going to worship. Like, oh, no, you should worship, even though it seems hard, because it will be easy when you get there, and it'll make your life a hell of a lot easier, a heaven of a lot easier, I should say. But what happens here is that Lot is insistent, and Lot's men are insistent. That there needs to be conflict, and Abram is saying like, "Oh, let's go. If I go right, you should go left, right? And if I go left, you should go right." And that's an interesting thing because it's implying that there should be a separation. It's not ready. They're not ready to purify this the Lord, and the divine Christ principle in you is not ready to purify that lower natural man, that external self, the outer self. That happens later. That's one of the things depicted by Abraham's almost sacrifice of Isaac. And it happens throughout Genesis. But what happens is that we're staving it off for a while because it's not ready. They're not ready to be, the lower self is not ready to be purified. And I've seen that before. For instance, I teach a class at BYU, a class, world literature, comparative literature, and we're going up until the Renaissance. And one of the students told me the other day that on one of the first days, I was teaching things that were so unorthodox, but so plainly and apparently spiritual and uplifting that she could tell that she had to make a choice. She had to make a choice to either stick with the letter of the law, strict, hard truth of the Latter-day Saint Church, or kind of fall into the more fuzzy truth, more fuzzy goodness that I was giving her. And she chose to fall in. And she's so thankful. I'm not boasting, obviously. I'm boasting in God, who's helped me in a certain sense. But the point I'm making is that she said you could see students all had to make that choice. You can see that different ones made different choices, and I see that in the class. Some of them have their attention fixed. They look rapt with attention, their eyes open. And others, especially the ones toward the periphery, and this is important. Not everyone in the periphery. If you're watching, it's not necessarily you. If those in the periphery tend to kind of look away. They look to the side, to the left or to the right. And that's what's happening here, is that if you look at someone, if you look straight at someone, like it's like you right before you kiss, or when you have prolonged eye contact in a non-threatening way, there's a conjunction that happens, an opening happens. And this is something I've just learned as someone with autism, because I'm normally very closed. But I've learned to open through the eyes, and it's the most wonderful, overwhelming but wonderful thing that I've ever experienced, is to have that tunnel of opening between me and the other person, one that doesn't just push, one that also lets the other person recreate themselves in me, to resurrect in me. And that's a conjunction. And Swedenborg talks about how the divine appears in heaven as a sun, right? But this sun isn't just a sun over there. It's always in front of you. And if there's another angel, another person in heaven, they will appear on the other side of the sun. But that doesn't mean God is getting in front of them. No, it means that your union, your love, is in God. And that love is that opening, that tunnel. But if you don't do that, you have to kind of turn to the side. You have to turn to the side. And Swedenborg talks about that, actually. You should look it up. I don't remember exactly what it is. Something about the heavenly and the spiritual angels being like 30 degrees to the side or something. Kind of pass each other by. Whoop. But that's the idea, is that if you don't conjoin, you have to kind of cast your gaze aside. You don't look. It's like the Indiana Jones ride in Disneyland. It's like, don't gaze into the eye of Mara. And it's like, oh, you gazed into the eye of Mara. Now time for a fun extravaganza in the underworld. But you get my point. You're not supposed to look at God without the right kind of consciousness, which is love. Because if you do, you'll hurt the other person. You'll hurt God and you'll hurt yourself. But they aren't looking at me, and I think it's because, like in this case, they're not ready. They've rejected it. Like I said, I'm not being vain. I'm not boasting. I just know that these are true things. And you see that too with a lot of ex-Mormons, because the Book of Mormon is an amazingly powerful book, as my dream kind of alluded to. It is divine truth, I believe, but you see that a lot with ex-Mormons, because what they'll do is you can almost see it in their faces. They have to fight the impulse of goodness and truth in them to stay away. There's like a pull, a call toward it that they have to fight with an equally strong force. And it's harmful, and you can kind of see it in their bitterness and their cynicism. And it's like a lot of times I see people who have left the church without really ever getting into the church, and I kind of feel like they've been protected from that conflict. But it's not like the ex-Mormons are hopelessly lost. It's just that, well, it's just that they don't really remember what they felt. And here's what I mean. It's easy to forget the taste of goodness and truth after you've tasted it. You remember that you tasted it, but you don't remember the taste. You've forgotten it. You just remember that you tasted something, and you're like, oh, I made that up. But that's a kind of protection. That's a kind of protection like what's going on here. It goes like this. It goes, there's a slipping by. You don't see the inside. There isn't this gaze of soul to soul. There's instead a passing by at 30 degrees. And love. And this love that conjoins isn't there. You just pass by, and it's like almost like Jesus talking about parables. I don't remember the exact quote, but he said that to the effect that I tell parables so that those who can hear will be able to hear, and those who shouldn't hear won't hear. And that's true. The Book of Mormon is the same way. It seems to be an obvious fraud, but if you read it and you have faith, you realize that despite its appearance of being an obvious fraud, it is good. It's really good. It reaches your soul. It touches you. And I've watched lots of testimony videos on YouTube. I've been to testimony meetings for decades, and I can tell you that people aren't making some of this stuff up. Some of it they're making up, but not a lot of it. But this is something that Gurdjieff did, right? He was a spiritual teacher in the early 20th century, and he tried to look like a con man so that people who would not benefit from his teachings would just pass him by. But he wasn't a con man, because really what he was doing is he was tricking people out of their egos. He's an amazing person, and you can feel a spiritual force from his Beelzebub's tales to his grandson like nothing else. I have it right here. Beelzebub's tales to his grandson. Right here. A book just fell. Oh well. Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, and he talks in it about how, in this first chapter, before he gets into the real narrative of what he's doing, he talks about how this book is essentially like a bunch of red pepper pods that you buy without knowing what kind of fruit they are, and you just keep eating them because you bought them. It's like, oh, I bought them, I'm going to keep eating them because, it's like when you're on a spree, you buy... how does it go? It's like, when out on a spree, go the whole hog, including the postage, something like that. I probably massacred that, but it's the idea that if you are into something, you better well finish it, You complete the state, in other words, as in Swedenborgian terms, and you do feel something like red pepper pods in you when you read Beelzebub's tales to his grandson, a heat in you, like a sunrise, like a surging forth. And it's amazing. It changes your consciousness like nothing else. But that's the idea, is that these divine texts, this vessel for heat, for fire, for divine goodness, affects you if you're open to it. But if you're not, it'll just pass you by. And that's what's happening here. But they do pass each other by, and Lot goes to Jordan and Abram goes to Canaan. And what that means is that there's a place for the lower mind and a place for the higher mind. And they kind of pass by each other and they both flourish. And that's a good thing. You can kind of see this with the brain anatomy. I don't know if there's a strict parallel between the outer mind and the left hemisphere, but there's at least a little bit of one. And this is something in a book called, what is it? The Master and His Emissary by Iain McGilchrist. Very Swedenborgian book, by the way, by a neuroscientist. He's basically saying that the crisis of the modern world has been the rejection of the right hemisphere of the brain's functions. And he's crucial. He's very, very crucial. But one of the things he said in this is just neuroscience. I didn't know this before. But he says that the corpus callosum, the thing that bridges the gaps between the hemispheres, one of its major functions is to actually inhibit, it's inhibitory, and its function is to prevent basically the left and the right hemisphere from knowing each other are there. They pass each other by, like the 30-degree thing that Swedenborg talks about with the celestial kingdom and the spiritual kingdom, which actually do correspond to the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And that's what's going on here, is they kind of pass each other by and they don't know each other are there, and they get to their own place and they're safe and they're separate. Like in my class, like I'm teaching the ones in the center and the ones in the periphery are on their phones. And they're fine. They're fine. They just have rejected it. And it's not most of them, by the way. Most of them really like it. But Jordan, right, it flourishes. And what it means is that even in the state where you reject the internal, you benefit from it. You can kind of see this when you're dreaming. When you wake up from a dream, even if you don't understand the dream, you feel refreshed and rejuvenated purely by the feelings that are in you. Not just on a bodily level, but on a mental level. You feel like you've had a reset button, and it's because of the dreams, I think, that happens. The dreams have taken the flotsam and jetsam, the things that don't have categories, and by loosening things, have put them into the right boxes with all the looseness that happens that I talked about. And so basically that's what's happening here in Genesis 12, is that in Genesis 12 and Genesis 13, you kind of slip Abram into Egypt. You kind of steal something back, and then it's like you slip under the rug, so to speak. You vessel it rightly in a certain sense. I don't know how to say that, but I referenced it in another video. But after you dream, you get a sense that you've been rejuvenated, even though you don't understand the dream. And what's interesting is that on that point is that if you ever think that, oh, that dream was nonsense, just repeat the dream out loud to somebody. It'll make more sense then. Because there is an impulse whenever we dream to think that this makes no sense at the moment. This is just static. This is just flotsam and jetsam. But in the moment of recounting it, you see a structure there. I've seen this happen a lot. For instance, one of my friends who's very liberal and is very feminist in a good way, both of those in a good way, she had a dream about Winston Churchill talking down to her, and she's like, this is just nonsense. I'm like, listen to what you're saying. Patriarch, British Empire, she's like, oh, yeah. You see that a lot. It's like you understand what the dream is as you write it down, as you say it. But in the moment, it makes no sense because there's this passing by that happens. The inner meaning isn't trickling down to your lower egoic level, the part of you that really is awake when you're awake. And it flourishes after the dream by the trickling down, as it were. And so that flourishes. And you kind of get this, like people read the Book of Mormon, and even though they reject, in a certain sense, that they don't understand the internal meaning, they benefit from it. They feel the Spirit, or they feel the Spirit when you read the Bible, or read Beelzebub's Tales or whatever. But Abram also flourishes, and because the inner self is flourishing, and God basically tells him, he says, your seed shall be as the sand of the sea and the dust of the earth. And what that means is that love, goodness, will infest everything. It will get into every nook and cranny. It will make the world into a thing of love. And you can see that in somebody who is in divine goodness and divine truth. They radiate goodness. I felt that in people before. They radiate it. They just proliferate it. They're infectious, viral with goodness and love. And that's the seed as the dust of the earth and the sand of the sea. That's spiritual reproduction, as it were. And that's the end of that chapter. So this was shorter than the other ones, but I think this is good.